So I thought I'd go over, what DevExpress is, who DevExpress are, some of the features and products that they have. So they're a company, obviously, and they make components for programmers. And they make a lot of components, high quality, sort of best in show type stuff. And they also make a couple of products that they've actually created themselves from their own components. So I thought I'll just go over a few things. So I'm at the website here. So they're making Windows components for writing Windows applications. They create JavaScript, Blazor, ASP.NET. So they've got most applications covered. They also do other tools and things like that for reporting, for accessing PDF documents, Excel documents and things. Got some really incredible controls. Mobile development for mobile phones, stuff like that. And cross-platform XAF development, which is something that I use all the time, and I'll get into that in a bit. So if we go down here, you can see that they have a whole bunch of components. They've got like 190 controls, and they support WCF, also VCL, which is something called Delphi. It's not a .NET product, but something they've always supported. You've got Blazor, which is basically a new technology that Microsoft are bringing out to do with creating mobile applications, sort of like an alternative to JavaScript where you're using C#. I've never really used it, but apparently that's the next big thing. They make a lot of reporting products, so being able to actually create fancy reports and allowing end users put them into create reports. Now, a few things to say about DevExpress. Not only do they have great products, but their documentation and their support system is the best that I've ever used. And if you want to just have a play around with the products, you can just go and check out their demos because they're pretty substantial. So you can see that they've got a whole bunch of actual real world examples of applications that they've created for the different products. So you definitely want to go and check out the demo section. If you have a look around, you'll see that you can actually run the demos. So when you install DevExpress, it will have installed a demo application that basically allows you to basically a playground. So if you click on them, it should open up the software and give you some great demonstrations of real-world applications. That's a bit big. Don't know whether that's going to capture that. But yeah, so they're showing you what the different controls can do, and you can play with them, and figure out where what controls you might want to use yourself. So there's a lot going on. So there's other demos here. Here's their JavaScript demos. We can click on just click on that one, see what happens. So this is all running in the browser. These are using their JavaScript controls. So lots of good stuff there. So another thing you want to check out from these sections is you can go to the documentation directly. You can go to online training. They've got all sorts of videos and things like that. That's a great spot to go to to figure out how everything works. DevExpress also have their own YouTube channel with zillions of videos on how to do things. So lots of resources, and I think they even sell training. Yeah. So they've actually got their own courses that they've created as well, which might be a good resource if you want to dive into it like that. Let's just jump straight into Visual Studio, and I'll show you how the DevExpress controls can be used. So I've just started Visual Studio here, and what we want to do is we want to create a new project. And from here, you'll be able to find all sorts of templates to start projects. If you want to find the DevExpress ones, just search for DevExpress, and you get all sorts of templates in here. So, if you want to create a Blazor application, you would choose that template, the WPF application, all sorts of things. I think we'll create a Windows form application because that is the most standard type, and we'll get to the XAF stuff a little bit later. I think this makes more sense. So yeah, we've got DevExpress WinForms app template, using C# for Windows. Click on that. Give it a name. And create. And so here we come to a template that is going to basically give you a quick start on building an application. Is it going to be a blank application? Do you want it to have a toolbar? Do you want to have ribbons? Do you want to have a tabbed influence, fluent design? But there are also some pre-made ones here where they're going to use some of their more powerful components here. So do you want to create a word processing application, or a spreadsheet application, or a PDF viewer, or a map application, etc., etc.? So what we're going to do is maybe we'll create a word processing application. Maybe that's too much to begin with. Let's just create a blank application so I can show you how everything's going to interact with Visual Studio. Okay, so what you're seeing here is bog standard Visual Studio. This is the way that it looks. And you can see down on this side, it has created a form for us, which is this form here. So on the left-hand side, you'll see loads of different components. So the ones with DX, 22.2, they're the DevExpress components that have been installed when the DevExpress installer was installed. They would have been automatically added to Visual Studio. And then you have all of the normal forms controls that come with Visual Studio. I don't have any real other third-party controls installed on here at the moment. If I did, they would just appear over here. So, friends, if we want to use something, it's just a matter of finding the control that we want and just dragging it on there, and away we go. There's nothing very simple about this. There's nothing difficult about it. Sorry. So if I want a panel control, I just drag it onto there. This is the DevExpress panel control, and you will notice that there's a lot of duplication. So if I search for button, you will see that DevExpress have some buttons, right? But there's also the buttons that come with Windows. So why would DevExpress create a button when there's already an existing button there? Why would they create a duplicate control of the controls that come with Visual Studio? So there's a couple of reasons. One of them is that they can add extra functionality that doesn't come with a normal button, but also DevExpress comes with the ability to skin controls, so have themes, and you can apply those themes. Like, you can say, I want my entire application to suddenly use a dark color scheme, or I want to use a fancy color scheme. I think in the past I've even seen color schemes that were skinned for Halloween and things like that. So it can only skin its own controls. So if you have a mixture, so you've got a normal button here and a DevExpress button here, and then you apply a skin to this application, it'll look weird on the non-DevExpress controller. The skin won't affect it. So that's part of that reason. So let's just go straight to the DevExpress XAF framework. This is the framework that we use all the time, and it takes a bit of explaining, so we might as well jump straight into it. So if I go and find the DevExpress template, just get rid of the old project, and we come up here with a wizard that's going to guide us through how we are going to create an XAF based application. So we can run the wizard, and what it's basically going to say here is, well, it can actually create more than one type of application at the same time. So you can create a Windows form application for running on a desktop. You can also create a web application, and you can create a service. This is all new. This is like new functionality. I think what this is creating a back-end API for calling stuff. So previously this was not Blazor, this was ASP doing the website. If you go back to older versions of DevExpress, you'll get those options, but in the very latest version you only get these options. So what we're going to do is you're just going to do desktop and web. So basically we're going to create two applications that look and feel essentially the same, but one you can run on Windows PC and the other you can run as a website. So the next thing is, do you want to use Entity Framework or do you want to use XAF persistent objects? So this is fairly critical. It's going to take a little bit of explaining as to what's going on. It's defaulting to Entity Framework. This is something that Microsoft have created. DevExpress had their own persistent objects, XPO framework, that they pretty much invented well before the Microsoft stuff came along and became popular. But now they've basically decided that everyone should be using the Microsoft one. That's the way of the future. And I've never used it. The concept is relatively simple, and so just for this demo I'm going to choose XPO because that's what I know. It'll be easier for me to explain. So then it comes down to, well, if you've got an application, what's the authentication? Do you want no authentication, in which case when you run the application, it just starts up? Or do you want to have it give a username and password, and each person has to be a user in the system? So I would always do it. And then of course you can have Active Directory, or is it just standard, username, password stuff? Or do you want to have it hooked into your Active Directory? I don't have Active Directory on this computer, but corporate wise, you would probably choose Active Directory. You can swap that out later on. It's not hard to change between the two. You have to choose the type of security that you want. You have to look that up. But for the purposes of this, we'll just go forward. So now it says, okay, well, we've got a whole bunch of feature modules that we're going to add into your application. You choose the ones that you want. And there's so many, it's really difficult for me to explain just right now what's going on. But basically this is saying, well, you need this, the business class. Do you want things like dashboards in your application? Do you want to be able to clone objects? Do you want charts? Do you want to be able to use file attachments in your application? Do you want to have a KPI module? Do you want to have notifications? All of this stuff, which you have to get used to, what they actually are. Now, these can be added later. This is just the wizard, right? So this is not something that you're stuck with. It's just trying to help you out in the beginning. So then we choose our modules, and bang, we are now creating a solution which is going to include two different applications. One is going to be a web-based application, and one is going to be a Windows-based application. Now, like I say, I always choose to have a Windows application and a web application every time. It is possible to go back later and do it, but there are advantages. Even if you think that you're only going to be using the web side of it, I would still do the Windows side as well. Because we all know there are some features of web applications that you can't get. They're only existing in the Windows ones. So here we go. So we have this application, and if we were to just run it, we will have a application. Like all of those modules that we chose will be there. So it'll take a little while to start up. Right, and the first thing is the security system, and I don't know what the default one is. Is it admin with no password? Okay, so there you go. So we now have an application, the things that we chose as modules already exist in this application. So, and one of the things is the security system. So it's created a couple of default users for us, but there we go. So if you wanted to see what was happening with the Windows version, we can just stop that. Start a new instance of the Windows version. You can see here there's a lot of, they've already got links here for you to just go and go to the important things here. So same deal, I have to log in. It's gone off to the side, but there we go. So we've basically got the same thing. And the reason that they can do this is because they essentially have created a web, they've tried to create web versions and Windows versions of all of their controls, which means that they can use a template and generate two applications for the price of one. Okay. So why have they created this framework, this XAF framework? It has a lot to do with the fact that when you write applications, business type applications, they're 90% exactly the same every single time that you write one, right? You for instance, you want to have a security system where people can log in, and you want to have a ribbon interface here, and you want to be able to navigate on the left hand side, and you want to be able to create reports, and you want to be able to do all these sort of things. So if you were to do all of those things by scratch every single time you wrote one of these applications, you would end up spending a couple of weeks putting this together before you actually added any of the code that does the thing that the application needs to do. So it helps out in that. And this was basically called a low code system. So the amount of code you actually have to write is way less. So there are some disadvantages to this sort of thing. I mean, obviously, sometimes it can create longer to do things than you could do it manually, because you have to do it the way that it's been specified in the application. But as you can see, you've essentially created an application within seconds. So what I've discovered is that the pros and cons, there are so many more pros in doing it this way than there are cons. And of course, because this is actually made up of all of their components, you can 100% remake this by hand yourself, just using Visual Studio and normal forms and normal controls and stuff like that. You've got the best of both worlds, really, when you're doing this sort of thing. So it was pretty quick for us to create an application. I should point out that XAF is a database-driven application. So it needs to connect to a database, and you didn't see it do that. It did actually create a whole bunch of records for the user structures, and you never saw any of that, because by default it will default to using MS SQL. And the way it does this is, if I go down in here and find the app config, and we scroll down, you'll see that there's a thing called a connection string, and it's already been pre-filled out with local. It assumes that you have a local copy of SQL Server running, and it already filled it out with the name of our application. So if we were to go and look using Database Explorer, we would see there is indeed a database called Jerry XAF, and it's got some tables already in it. So this is a really important feature about XAF as well, and that is that it supports many different databases. So it will support MS SQL, it'll support MySQL, it'll support, well, I'll bring up the list of the ones that it supports. So there's a lot of different databases that it supports. I won't read them out. You can have a look at all of those if you like. If you've ever played around with databases or writing applications for databases, you'll know that not every database is the same. And so when you write applications that support a particular database, and then someone says to you, hey, now we want to move from MS SQL to MySQL, not all of the queries and things like that are going to work. So you have to code around those things. With DevExpress, you don't need to do that. You actually can create your application, and you can go into just the connection string and change the provider. Put a thing in here that says the provider is now MySQL or Postgres, and it does a whole lot of things under the covers to make sure that they work. So it will actually change the way that queries work to suit the database that you want to use. So I think we really need to talk about how the system uses the database. How does the data get in there? I guess the easiest way to understand why this model view model type architecture works, well, this is how I understand it, right? So you can look it up, but basically in the olden days, if you wanted to create database-driven applications, you would have somebody employed to model all of the data that you would need. And that person would then pass that model on to a programmer or a database guy, and he would have to craft the SQL queries in order to create those tables in the database. And then you would have to pass it on to a programmer, or it would probably go to a UX designer who would then design what the forms would look like to hold that data. And then finally you'll get to a programmer whose job it would be to, place boxes onto the screen and then run queries to say select this data from here and insert it into the appropriate controls. There's a lot of steps involved in that, and it used to cause a lot of problems too, especially when you would have these big projects that people did, and it would come a day before you wanted to release it, and then somebody would come along and say, hey, we need this extra field in this in the database, and it would be like, well, you would have to redo everything. There's so many parts to getting a piece of that text onto a form that we could end up breaking the entire program. And that was something that obviously people who aren't programmers didn't understand the complexity of it. So it used to cause a lot of problems. So one way around that is to say, well, what if we modeled the data, and from that model, the system would automatically handle the rest of that. So it would automatically generate the tables in the databases for us. It would automatically generate the views for us, the forms. It would automatically populate the data for us. So that way, every time that we change the model, everything else would automatically get updated. So that's really how this is working, and I'm going to show you how that works. It'll make more sense if I give you a practical example. So you can see when we created this solution, we got 3 projects in here. We got the Blazor server, which is the web application. We got the .win project, which is actually the Windows application. And then we got this other one called .module. So this is where the business objects, amongst other things, live. And it's the business objects that actually describe the data. And you can see that there is already a couple of objects placed in there for the users. So we could go in there. It's a bit hard for me to show you that. It's a bit too complex for the example I want to use. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a DevExpress item, and we're going to call it an XP business object. Okay. If you remember, that's the underlying data structures that we chose in the beginning. So we might create a little application that keeps track of bugs and features in software development projects, right? To do that, we first of all need to create a business object, and this is basically just a class. It's like a C# class. And let's call it project. Now this automatically created a class over here, and it filled it with a whole bunch of stuff in here. But basically what's going to happen is, as we add objects to this class, they are then going to trigger the system when we run it to create tables and fields that match the properties in these classes. And it's also going to create views for us so that we can see that data, edit that data, interact with that data. So to do this, I'm going to create a property called name for our project. Now, what I did then is I actually used a shortcut to create this property. So DevExpress create a product called CodeRush, which helps a programmer to write code more quickly than they could normally. Hopefully you've got that. But basically what happens is you start by typing something. So if I wanted to create a property, a string property, I would go PS, and then I'd hit the space bar, and it would write all the information that I need for a generic property. Okay, so the properties in business classes are actually a little bit different. They're actually called something else. They have a different signature. They have this set property value. This is part of the internal stuff. So actually, to create properties to be used in business objects, it's actually XP and then the initial of the type, the data type that you want, and then you hit the space bar. So in this case, so I put in name. Right, so we now have a property called name, and it put an attribute here that said default string mapping size, right, which is mapped to 100. That means that this is going to be a column that is going to be able to store only 100 characters. I can change that if I need to. I could make it, I could just put in a value in there of 200 characters if I wanted to do that. But it sees that it's a string, and so depending on the database, it'll create a string data type or a varchar data type or whatever is appropriate for that particular database. Okay, so that's all I've done. Over here, I created a class called project, which contained a property called name. Okay, so now if I run my application, and I'm going to set this to be the default. The default project, so the Windows one will be the default project. You see what happens. Okay. So if you go and have a look, you will now see that there is now a navigation item to project, and we can use new to create a new project, and I could call it project 1. Save. Right? So if you think about what happened, it created a table inside the database for me called project, and it created a column in there called name, and then it used that structure to give me a navigation item on the left hand side, and this is a list view here. So if we had lots of projects, project 2. I can now choose it in this list view, and I can double click on it and open it up into what's called a detail view, where I can change the name. Okay, so with only a couple of lines of code, we've got a lot of work already being done for us. Okay, so that was pretty cool, but we're not going to get very far in an application with just one table. So let's create another one. So what will we call this? So we go back to DevExpress. We will create XPO business object, and we'll call it how about stakeholder? Okay. So we want some people who are going to be assigned to this project. And we'll go down here, XP. What are we going to call it? This is going to be a string. And we're going to call this name. Okay, so that's the name of a stakeholder, a person that's going to be involved. We'll just put some extra information in there just for fun. So we'll put in, I don't know, an integer value. age. Why we would need that, I have no idea. But we'll just put it in there because I want to show you how it deals with different data types. So we've got name, we've got age, put another string in there, phone number. It's probably a more sensible thing. So now we've got 3 values in there, and if we build our application, we should see that we now have 2 tables with different data in there, which we can navigate to in exactly the same way by clicking on the list view. So if we look here, we can see we've got project and we've got stakeholder. Okay, so if we create a stakeholder, you can see it's automatically populated these values, and because I said that age was an integer value, it gave me different control in order to use that. Now this can all be, you don't have to take the default values, it's just purely using the order in which the properties appeared. In actual fact, you know, DevExpress is just full of layout values and things like that. So we can just change it interactively if we want. So that's great, right? But how is that of any use to us? Because really what we want is a project to have stakeholders associated with it. And at the moment, the only values in there are name of the project. How do we get stakeholders? How do we create that relationship? So let's do that. So the database guys will be saying, well, okay, so there needs to be, you know, relationships. There needs to be, as you would in any databases, you would need to have a one-to-one relationship between tables, or a one-to-many, or a many-to-many relationship. You know, that's what needs to happen under the covers with the database. But because we're abstracted from that, we need a way of defining that internally in the classes. So let's do that. So if we go to project, we can use a shortcut here called EXPCL, and this is going to create a relationship. So the relationship is going to be to stakeholder. Okay, so we're going to want to have many stakeholders being able to be chosen for these projects, but we also want it to be a many-to-many relationship with stakeholders being able to be assigned to as many projects as they want. So we'll go to stakeholders and we'll do the same thing. Okay, and we need to make sure they both so this is all part of the coding syntax. I don't really want to go into any details about it. But really what we're doing is we're creating a one-to-many, a many-to-many relationship. And that's going to be reflected as soon as we build it. So if we go into project number 1, we can add stakeholders. We can either create new ones from here, or we can link to existing stakeholders. So Jerry, I don't think I saved myself. That's all right. Last time. So we can create. And so when we go into project 1, we can see that we have 2 stakeholders associated with that. And because it's a many-to-many relationship, we should be able to also, you know, go the other way, so that stakeholders can have relationships back to projects, as many projects as they want. Okay, that was an awful lot of information to try and give you in one hit. But I'm just trying to explain the very basics of what's going on, how the XAF framework is designed to operate, and sort of how it works underneath the covers as well. So I hope that was of some use. There's a lot more detail that we need to go into. Like I said, the documentation on DevExpress is so good that there are lots of resources out there that will explain things in a lot more detail than I have just done.